What would you do if you found yourself in the wilderness, where civilization ends? No heating bills, no stores, no emergency services. Your home is a hut, and your dinner is whatever you can catch with your bare hands. In winter, you face a 6-month death sentence. Minus 40 degrees, 4.5 meters of snow, and no sign of a road in spring. In such a situation, there is no room for romance or sentimentality, only the bare instinct for survival. And here arises the main question. What forgotten techniques, which seem exotic or mythical to us today, could save your life and the lives of your family? How did these people, our pioneering ancestors, manage not only to survive, but to thrive when nature was their only source of sustenance? They didn't sit on the shore with fancy new fishing rods. They had no choice. But they had ingenuity, observation skills, and 7 ingenious ways of catching fish that would seem incredible to most of us today. Forget about standard fishing rods and bait. Watch until the end, and you'll learn what skills determined whether they would die of hunger or wake up full. On the frontier, where even a simple needle was valuable and metal hooks were rare, every settler learned to use what nature provided. Bone became one of the most versatile materials. A small bone from a bird, deer, or even a hare could be turned into a survival tool. The simplest and most effective method was to create a hidden fishing hook. The settler would take a thin but strong bone, cut off a piece a few centimeters long, and sharpen both ends to a point. This sharpening process required patience and skill, as it was done with a sharp stone or flint knife. The ideal tool was made from long, thin bones, such as those from the legs of large birds or the ribs of small animals, which were strong enough but easy to work with. Then a small notch was made in the middle of the bone. This notch was not deep. It was used to tie fishing line made from nettle fibers, animal tendons, or even horsehair. Unlike the traditional J-shaped hook, which catches the fish's mouth, the hidden hook worked differently. It was tied to the line so that it was parallel to it. The bait, usually a piece of meat, a worm, or even cornmeal dough, was placed on the bone, completely covering it. When the fish swallowed the bait, the line was pulled tight. At that moment, the sharp angle of the bone turned across the fish's esophagus and stuck firmly, preventing it from escaping. This method had an important advantage. It did not require any complicated tools to make, just a sharp stone or knife. And most importantly, it was almost invisible to fish. Thanks to its simplicity and effectiveness, this method was especially popular with those who lived far from trade routes, where every ounce of metal was precious. Have you heard of this method? Write your answer in the comments, and also tell us where you are watching us from. Choosing the right bone was key. Settlers preferred bones that were porous and light, yet strong enough. For example, tubular bird bones were ideal for this purpose. Not only were they easy to work with, but they were also flexible enough to withstand the pressure when the fish tried to break free. The bone was processed by polishing it against a smooth stone to remove any rough edges or burrs that could scare away fish or damage the line. This process transformed a simple bone into an elegant and effective tool for survival. When it comes to fishing, we immediately think of a rod and bait, but in the world of pioneers, things were different. Sometimes they didn't even have the simplest fishing line. What then? They used what they had, their observation skills and knowledge of animal behavior. One such unique skill is acoustic bait, a method based on the use of sound waves. Early settlers noticed that fish, especially in murky or dark waters where sight is useless, navigate not only by sight but also by hearing and vibration. They knew that sound travels much faster and farther in water than in air, and they learned to use this to their advantage. They learned to create primitive acoustic lures. These could be sticks that were lowered into the water and vibrated, or even simple stones that were thrown into the water at a certain rhythm. For example, a settler could take a stick, tie a stone to it, and rhythmically tap it on the bottom or on a stone under the water. The vibrations spread through the water, attracting curious fish. This rhythmic sound imitated feeding or the movement of small prey, triggering the predator's hunting instinct. Another method involved using a flat board that was lowered into the water and scraped along the bottom. The sound was similar to the scraping of shells or the movement of crayfish, which also attracted fish. But how did they manage to guess the right rhythm and frequency so as not to scare the fish away, but attract them instead? Stay with us to find out the answer to this question. The secret was in imitating natural sounds. The pioneers spent hours observing the behavior of fish and their food sources. They listened to the sound of crayfish moving along the bottom and small fish splashing in shallow water and tried to reproduce these sounds. Repetition and consistency were key. It's one thing to just throw rocks into the water, but it's another to do it with a certain rhythm, creating the illusion of a living creature. They quickly learned to distinguish which sounds attracted one fish and which attracted another. For example, slow, heavy blows attracted catfish, while quick, light blows attracted trout. This art was a real science, based on careful observation of nature and its laws. In the harsh conditions of the frontier, constant presence at the water's edge was a luxury that not everyone could afford. Families worked constantly, building, hunting, and cultivating the land. Time was the most valuable resource. That is why they developed fixed fishing devices that worked without constant supervision. These were passive traps that could catch fish while the settlers were busy with other things. One of the most common methods was basket traps woven from flexible branches, such as willow. These baskets had a narrow entrance facing inward, which allowed fish to swim in easily, but prevented them from swimming back out. The trap was submerged in the water and bait was placed inside, such as cornmeal or crushed fish. These traps were remarkably effective. Another method was to create so-called stone barriers. In shallow streams or rivers, settlers built low walls of stones that directed the flow of water into a narrow passage where the trap was set. This method allowed fish to be caught in large quantities. Would modern people be able to do this? In my opinion, many modern people, especially those with no experience of survival in the wild, would face serious difficulties. We are accustomed to comfort and have no knowledge of weaving, construction, or even the behavior of fish in their natural environment. However, nowadays there are various survival courses that teach such skills, and some enthusiasts can master these methods. Nevertheless, for most people, it would be a completely new and probably difficult experience that requires time and practice. Today, we are used to storing fish in the refrigerator or freezer, but in the 19th century, such conveniences did not exist. Salt, if it was available, was an expensive commodity, and it was impossible to use it to preserve all the fish that was caught. Therefore, pioneers developed ingenious preservation methods that did not require salt. Cold smoking was one of the most reliable methods. It differed from hot smoking in that the fish was not cooked, but slowly processed by smoke at a low temperature. For this purpose, settlers built special smokehouses, small wooden sheds or pits covered with branches and earth. Smoke from smoldering wood, most often deciduous species such as maple or alder, slowly permeated the fish. This process took from several days to several weeks. The smoke contained formaldehyde and other antimicrobial substances that prevented the growth of bacteria and mold. Another method was drying in the sun and wind. The fish was cut into thin strips, which were hung on special wooden frames in a shady but well-ventilated place. In this process, not only the speed of drying was important, but also protection from insects and animals. How did they manage to avoid contamination of the fish if there were no antiseptics nearby? The success of drying depended on several key factors. First, the freshness of the fish. They processed the fish immediately after catching it, which significantly reduced the risk of bacterial growth. Second, the right choice of drying location. The settlers hung the fish in well-ventilated areas where strong winds quickly dried the surface, creating a natural barrier to microorganisms. Third, they used smoke from bonfires to scare away insects that could lay eggs on the fish. Thus, the combination of speed, the right location, and the use of natural protective measures allowed them to effectively preserve their catch. But what if there is so much fish that you can't dry at all? You can't just throw it back, can you? Keep watching the video. The answer is coming soon. Woven nets were one of the most effective tools for mass fishing. Making such nets from traditional materials, such as rope, would have been too labor-intensive and expensive. Therefore, the settlers turned to nature once again. They used flexible willow rods and other shrubs that grew along the banks of rivers and lakes. The process began with gathering the rods and soaking them in water to make them even more flexible. They were then woven together to create a strong yet lightweight mesh structure. The weaving technique was similar to that used for making baskets, but with smaller steps. Depending on the size of the fish to be caught, different mesh sizes were made. This type of net had several advantages. It was strong enough to withstand the resistance of the fish, and at the same time flexible enough to be easily rolled up and transported. The net was also lightweight. In addition, the material was readily available and free, which made this method very popular. Making such a net required not only patience, but also a good knowledge of local plants. The settlers knew exactly what time of year was best for gathering willow rods, so that they would be as flexible and strong as possible. They also learned how to dry and treat the finished nets properly so that they would last longer. Often, to strengthen the net, it was dipped in resin or tar, which protected the wood from rotting. This technology, seemingly simple, was actually the result of many years of trial and error. Passing this knowledge from generation to generation was vital for survival on the frontier, as it determined access to one of the main sources of food. Settlers did not always have tools with them, even the most primitive ones. There were times when they found themselves in situations where survival depended on their instincts and ability to act quickly. One of the most unusual and little-known methods was fishing with bare hands, known as grabbing or nuddling. This method involved sticking your hand under a tree root or into a deep hole under the bank where fish could hide. This was especially common for catching catfish, which prefer such hiding places. The person would carefully lower their hand into the water and wait for the fish to come. When the fish bit their hand, they would quickly grab it by the gills. This method required not only courage, but also a deep understanding of fish behavior. On the frontier, where every resource was precious, settlers learned to use even plants that seemed useless at first glance. Some were used as bait, while others were used to paralyze fish. For example, some plants, such as indigo nuts, contained alkaloids that, when released into the water, affected the fish, causing temporary paralysis. The settlers crushed these plants and threw them into small enclosed bodies of water or backwaters. The fish quickly floated to the surface, where they could be easily collected by hand. This method was effective but required caution, as some of these plants could also be poisonous to humans. Other plants, such as pumpkin seeds or cornmeal, were used as bait. They not only attracted fish, but also served as a basis for ground bait. This made it possible to create a fishing spot where fish would return regularly. It was important to be able to identify these plants correctly and to know how to use them safely. Settlers who acquired this knowledge from indigenous peoples or from their own experience understood that such methods could only be used in stagnant water so as not to harm other parts of the river. After catching the fish, they washed it thoroughly to remove any remaining paralyzing substances. This method was a kind of secret weapon for quickly obtaining large quantities of fish, but due to its potential danger, it was used only in extreme cases and with great caution. This method, developed with the characteristics of the river current in mind, was ideal for catching fish in fast-flowing streams. The underwater trap was a conical structure woven from the same willow rods. It resembled a large basket with a narrow neck. The trap was set against the current. Its wide end was secured to the bank or bottom with stones and stakes, and the narrow end was directed downstream. The current itself drove the fish into the trap, and the conical shape prevented them from escaping. This passive method was incredibly effective for families who needed to provide themselves with food for a long time. The trap could stand for hours or even days, collecting fish while the settlers went about their business. This trap was a true engineering marvel of its time, created without any tools. The settlers carefully chose the location for its installation: narrow channels, whirlpools, or places where fish swam upstream. The strength and flexibility of the willow rods allowed the trap to withstand strong currents and the weight of the fish caught. A trap set in the morning could provide a family with dinner or even a supply for several days. This freed up time for other important tasks, such as building houses, working the land, or guarding the territory. Winter on the frontier was the harshest test. Lakes and rivers froze over, and fishing became impossible. But the pioneers found a way out. They noticed that fish gather in deeper, warmer areas of water in winter. To reach them, they used a simple but effective method. First, they made a hole in the ice. Then they used fire to attract the fish. Fish, especially those accustomed to searching for food in the dark, reacted to the light. Sometimes they used smoldering coals, which they lowered to the bottom of the water. The heat and light attracted fish. allowing them to catch them with spears or the same homemade hooks. This method was especially important when other sources of food became unavailable. And what did they do when the fire went out at night and the temperature dropped below zero? To prevent the hole from freezing, the settlers surrounded it with stones and covered it with snow to create insulation. They also used moss and leaves to reduce heat loss and keep the hole open as long as possible. If the fire went out, they used their knowledge of the night sky to navigate and built temporary shelters out of snow and branches to wait out the night. The temperature in these shelters was much higher than outside. They could build a new fire to keep warm and cook the fish they caught. Winter fishing required not only ingenuity, but also exceptional endurance. The pioneers' clothing was primitive, but its layering and use of animal skins allowed them to withstand the severe cold. They couldn't afford to go without food for long, so the risk for the catch was justified. Often, they went out onto the ice with their entire families, dividing up the tasks. Some chopped ice, some tended the fire, and some fished. This joint effort brought them together and helped them survive in the most unfavorable conditions. In small streams and rivers where the current was weak, the settlers used another ingenious method, a dam trap. They built a small dam out of stones and mud that completely blocked the stream, causing the water to rise. Then they made a small passage in the dam. A trap or net was set up in this passage. When the dam was ready, the settlers would make noise and splash the water upstream. The frightened fish would try to swim downstream and would end up right in the trap. This method not only allowed them to catch fish, but also to control the flow of water for other needs, such as watering their gardens. This was an example of how the settlers did not just survive, but actively change their environment to suit their needs. Building such a dam was laborious, but very effective. The settlers used flat stones to create a solid foundation and then filled the gaps with mud and clay to make the dam watertight. They carefully chose the location for the dam, taking into account the width of the stream, the speed of the current, and the availability of necessary materials. This method was especially useful during dry periods when streams dried up and fish gathered in the remaining pools. The dam trap was not just a fishing device, but part of a broader system of natural resource management. Like beavers, the settlers learned to modify the landscape to suit their needs. They built small irrigation channels from the dam to direct water to their vegetable gardens. In this way, the same structure served several purposes at once. It provided fish, facilitated irrigation, and even helped protect crops from wild animals by creating a water barrier. It was an example of true engineering thinking born out of extreme necessity. We have seen 10 unique methods that helped pioneer families survive on the harsh American frontier. These are not just stories. They are practical lessons that show how important it is to be able to adapt and use what nature gives you. These people did not wait for help. They created their own tools and developed their own technologies, drawing on knowledge passed down from generation to generation. Their survival was the result not only of physical strength, but also of incredible ingenuity and resourcefulness. These techniques, seemingly forgotten, may seem primitive today, but they were the bridge between life and death. Studying these methods allows us to look at history not as a dry chronology of events, but as a living chronicle of human will and intellect. What would you like to see next? Stories about survival in winter conditions, or perhaps hunting techniques? Leave your comments below, and of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos.